Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepbooks reading tonight. Settle in, slow everything down, and let the soft rain in the background carry you deeper into the quiet. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss a new chapter. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing that. If you want full early access to entire books, join the Patreon where complete series are available. Now take a breath, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's drift together into tonight's story. I told Charlie that I had a lot of urgent homework I needed to finish, and I simply didn't want anything at all to eat for dinner. There was a basketball game on the television that he was very excited about, though I had no idea what was special about the match, so he wasn't paying close enough attention to notice anything unusual in my face or the strained tone of my voice. Once I was safely in my room, I immediately locked the door behind me. I dug through my desk drawer until I found my old headphones, and I plugged them into my small compact disc player. I chose a compact disc that Phil had given me for Christmas, one of his favourite bands, but their music used a little too much screaming and bass for my usual tastes. I popped the compact disc into place, lay down on my bed and put on the headphones. Then I hit the play button and turned the volume up until the blaring noise actually began to hurt my ears. I closed my eyes tightly, but the persistent light from my lamp still intruded into the darkness, so I added a pillow over the entire top half of my face for extra darkness. I concentrated very deliberately on the aggressive music, trying to decipher the lyrics, trying to unravel the complicated, chaotic drum patterns in the noise. By the third time I had listened through the entire compact disc, I knew all the words to the choruses at the very least. I was genuinely surprised to find that I actually did like the band after all once I was finally able to get past the initial noise and chaos. I realized I would have to thank Phil again for the gift. The exercise worked exactly as intended. The shattering beats of the music made it completely impossible for my mind to think about anything else, which was the entire purpose of the desperate exercise. And I listened to the compact disc again and again until I was singing along with all of the songs, until finally I was pulled away by sleep. I opened my eyes into a familiar place, recognizing the deep green light of the forest, and I was vaguely aware in some distant corner of my consciousness that I was dreaming. I could hear the loud waves crashing against the unseen rocks somewhere nearby, and I knew that if I followed the sound and found the ocean, I would be able to see the sun. I was trying desperately to follow the sound of the water, but then Jacob Black was suddenly there, tugging roughly on my hand, pulling me back with all his strength toward the darkest, blackest part of the dense forest. I asked him what was wrong, but his face was frozen with pure fright as he yanked against my resistance. I did not want to go into the overwhelming darkness. He whispered, his voice terrified, that I had to run, and I heard Mike's voice calling out of the gloomy heart of the trees, urging me to follow him, but I couldn't see Mike anywhere. I kept pulling against Jacob's grasp, asking him why I should run, desperate now to find the sun and the light of the ocean. Suddenly, Jacob let go of my hand and yelped, falling to the dim forest floor, violently shaking as I watched in growing horror. I screamed his name, but he was gone. In his place was a large, menacing red-brown wolf with solid black eyes. The wolf faced away from me, pointing his bristling shoulders toward the shore, low growls issuing from between his exposed fangs. Mike cried out my name again from behind me, urging me to run, but I didn't turn around. I was fixed on a light that was coming directly toward me from the beach, growing brighter through the trees. Edward stepped out from the trees, his skin faintly glowing, his eyes cold, black and dangerous. He held up one hand and silently beckoned me to come toward him, while the wolf at my feet continued to growl low and warningly. I took a single step forward, moving toward Edward, and he smiled then, revealing his teeth were sharp and pointed. He purred the two words, "Trust me," and I took another deliberate step closer. The wolf launched himself across the space between me and the vampire, his fangs aiming directly for Edward's throat. I screamed, wrenching myself upright out of the deep sleep. and the sudden violent movement caused the headphones to pull the compact disc player off the bedside table, which clattered loudly to the wooden floor. My room light was still on, and I realized I was sitting fully dressed on the bed, still wearing my shoes, disoriented. I glanced at the clock on my dresser and saw that it was 5:30 in the morning. I groaned, falling back heavily and rolling over onto my face, then kicking off my boots. I was far too uncomfortable now to get anywhere near sleep, so I rolled back over and unbuttoned my jeans, yanking them off awkwardly as I tried to stay horizontal on the bed. I could feel the tight braid in my hair, an uncomfortable hard ridge pressing along the back of my skull. I turned onto my side and quickly ripped the rubber band out, running my fingers through the plaits to comb them out, then pulled the pillow back over my eyes to block the light. It was absolutely no use, of course, because my subconscious mind had done its job perfectly, dredging up exactly the disturbing images I had been trying so desperately to avoid the night before. I knew I was going to have to face them now, with the cold light of this very early morning. I sat up, and my head spun briefly for a minute, as the blood flowed back downward. I told myself that the first thing to do was to take care of my hygiene, happy to put off the hard thinking for as long as possible, and I grabbed my small bathroom bag. The shower did not last nearly as long as I had hoped it would, though. Even taking the extra time to blow dry my hair thoroughly, I was soon entirely out of things to do in the small bathroom. Wrapped in a towel, I crossed quickly back to my room. I checked the quiet house, unable to tell if Charlie was still asleep, or if he had already left for the day. I went to look out my window, and the cruiser was gone. He was out fishing again. I dressed slowly in my most comfortable sweats and then made my bed, something I almost never did, realizing I couldn't put off the inevitable confrontation any longer. I went to my desk and switched on my old computer. I absolutely hated using the internet here. My modem was sadly outdated, and my free service was completely substandard. Just dialing up took such an infuriatingly long time that I decided to go downstairs and get myself a bowl of cereal while I waited for the connection. I ate slowly, carefully chewing each bite. When I was finished, I washed the bowl and spoon, dried them carefully, and put them away. My feet dragged as I climbed the stairs back up to my room. I went to my compact disc player first, picking it up off the wooden floor and placing it precisely back in the center of the bedside table. I pulled out the headphones and put them away in the desk drawer. Then I turned the same compact disc back on, turning the volume down to the lowest point where it was just background noise, a soft hum, with another deep sigh. I turned to face my computer. Naturally, the screen was already completely covered in glaring pop-up advertisements. I sat in my hard folding chair and began the tedious task of closing all the little intrusive windows. Eventually, I made it to my favorite search engine. I shot down a few more inevitable pop-ups, and then, with a slow certainty, I typed in just one single word: vampire. The search took an infuriatingly long time, of course. When the results finally came up, there was a huge amount of material to sift through, including everything from movies and television shows to role-playing games, underground metal bands, and gothic cosmetic companies. Then I found one promising-looking site titled Vampires AZ. I waited impatiently for it to load, quickly clicking closed each new ad that flashed across the screen. Finally, the screen was finished loading, displaying a simple white background with academic-looking black text. 2 quotes greeted me on the home page, one from Reverend Montague Summers discussing the terrifying figure of the vampire, and another from Rousseau questioning who truly believes in vampires despite the complete judicial proof. The rest of the site was an alphabetized listing of all the different myths of vampires held throughout the world. The first entry I clicked on was the Daneg, a Filipino vampire supposedly responsible for planting taro on the islands long ago. The myth continued that the Daneg worked peacefully with humans for many years, but the partnership ended abruptly when a woman accidentally cut her finger, and a Daneg sucked her wound, finding the taste so enjoyable that it drained her body completely of blood. I read carefully through all the descriptions, looking for anything at all that sounded remotely familiar, let alone plausible. It seemed that most myths centered around beautiful women as demons and children as victims, and they felt like constructs created to explain away the high mortality rates for young children, or to give men an excuse for infidelity. Many of the stories involved bodiless spirits and warnings against improper burials. There wasn't much that sounded anything like the movies I had seen, and only a very few, like the Hebrew estuary and the Polish upia, were even preoccupied with the actual act of drinking blood. Only 3 entries really managed to catch my full attention. The Romanian Vorokulesi, a powerful undead being who could appear as a beautiful pale-skinned human. The Slovak Nalapsi, a creature so strong and fast it could massacre an entire village in the single hour after midnight. And one other, the Stragoni Benefici. About this last entry, there was only one brief, single sentence. Stragoni Benefici, an Italian vampire, said to be on the side of goodness and a mortal enemy of all evil vampires. That one small entry was an immense relief, the one myth among hundreds that actually claimed the existence of good vampires. Overall, though, there was little that truly coincided with Jacob's unnerving stories or my own strange observations. I made a little silent catalogue in my mind as I read, carefully comparing each myth to the facts: speed, strength, beauty, pale skin, eyes that shift colour, and then Jacob's criteria of being blood drinkers, enemies of the werewolf, cold-skinned and immortal. There were very few myths that matched even one single factor. I realised there was another problem, one I remembered from the small number of scary movies I'd seen, and it was backed up by today's reading. Vampires couldn't possibly come out in the daytime, as the sun would instantly burn them to a cinder. They were supposed to sleep in coffins all day, and emerge only at night, aggravated by the lack of useful information. I snapped off the computer's main power switch, not waiting for the machine to shut down properly. Beneath my irritation, I felt an overwhelming wave of embarrassment. The whole situation felt utterly stupid. I was sitting in my room, diligently researching vampires. I decided that most of the blame belonged squarely on the doorstep of the dreary town of Forks, and the entire sodden Olympic Peninsula, for that matter. I knew I absolutely had to get out of the house, but there was literally nowhere I actually wanted to go that didn't involve at least a 3-day drive. I pulled on my boots anyway, unsure exactly where I was headed, and went downstairs. I shrugged into my raincoat without even checking the weather, and stomped straight out the door. It was overcast, but the rain had not started yet. I ignored my truck and started walking east on foot, angling across Charlie's yard toward the ever-encroaching forest edge. It didn't take long until I was deep enough for the house and the road to become completely invisible, and the only sounds were the squish of the damp earth under my feet and the sudden harsh cries of the jays. There was a thin, familiar ribbon of a trail that led through the forest here, or I wouldn't have risked wandering on my own like this. My sense of direction was hopeless. I could get lost in surroundings far less confusing. The trail wound deeper and deeper into the quiet forest, mostly heading east as far as I could tell, snaking around the Sitka spruces, the hemlocks, the yews and the maples. I only vaguely knew the names of the trees around me, mostly due to Charlie pointing them out from the cruiser window in earlier, simpler days. There were many I didn't know, and others I couldn't be sure about because they were so completely covered in green parasites. I followed the trail as long as the internal push of my anger at myself kept me moving forward. As that self-anger started to ebb, I slowed my pace. A few drops of moisture began to trickle down from the canopy high above me, but I couldn't be certain if it was the beginning of a fresh rain, or simply pools left over from yesterday, held high in the leaves, slowly dripping their way back to the damp earth. I noticed a recently fallen tree. I knew it was recent because it wasn't yet entirely carpeted in moss, resting against the trunk of one of its sisters, which created a sheltered little bench just a few safe feet off the actual trail. I stepped over the ferns and sat down carefully, making sure my jacket was between the damp wood and my clothes, and leaned my hooded head back against the living tree. I knew this was the absolute wrong place to have come. I should have realized it. But where else did I have to go? The forest was deep green, and far too much like the setting in last night's terrifying dream to allow for any peace of mind. Now that I no longer had the sound of my soggy footsteps, the silence around me was piercing. The birds were quiet now too, and the drops increased in frequency, confirming it must be raining softly high above the canopy. The ferns stood higher than my head now that I was seated, and I realized someone could walk by on the path, just 3 feet away, and never see me. Here in the deep quiet of the trees, it was much easier to believe the absurdities that had embarrassed me when I was safely indoors. Nothing had changed in this ancient forest for thousands of years, and all the myths and legends of 100 different lands seemed far more likely in this green, hazy light than they had in my clear-cut bedroom. I forced myself to focus on the 2 most vital questions I still had to answer, doing so unwillingly. First, I had to decide if it was remotely possible that what Jacob had just told me about the Cullens could actually be true. Immediately, my mind responded with a resounding negative. It felt silly and morbid to even entertain such ridiculous notions. But what then, I asked myself again. There was simply no rational explanation for why I was alive at this very moment. I listed again in my head the strange things I had personally observed, the impossible speed and strength, the unnatural beauty, the pale, frigid skin, and the eye colour shifting from black to gold and back again. There were smaller things, too, that registered slowly, like how they never seemed to eat, and the disturbing grace with which they moved. I thought of the way he sometimes spoke, with unfamiliar cadences and phrases that better fit the style of a turn-of-the-century novel than that of a 21st century classroom. He had skipped class the day we did blood typing. He hadn't said no to the beach trip until he heard where we were actually going. He seemed to know exactly what everyone around him was thinking, except me. He had even told me clearly that he was the villain, that he was truly dangerous. Could the Cullens be vampires? Well, they were something. Something entirely outside the realm of rational justification was taking place right in front of my own incredulous eyes. Whether it was Jacob's cold ones or just my own internal superhero theory, Edward Cullen was absolutely not human. He was something profoundly more. So then, maybe, that would have to be my answer for the time being. And then came the most important question of all. What was I actually going to do if it was true? If Edward was a vampire, I could hardly make myself think the words, even now. Then what was the correct, sensible action? Involving someone else was definitely out of the question. I could barely believe it myself, and anyone I told would surely have me immediately committed. Only 2 practical options seemed available to me. The first was to take his own advice, to be smart, to avoid him as much as possible. This meant cancelling our unspoken plans, going back to ignoring him as far as I was able, and pretending there was an impenetrably thick glass wall between us in the one class where we were forced together. I would have to tell him to leave me alone, and mean it fiercely this time. I was gripped by a sudden sharp agony of despair as I truly considered that alternative, and my mind immediately rejected the pain, quickly skipping on to the only other option. I could simply do nothing different. After all, if he was something sinister, he hadn't done anything at all to hurt me so far. In fact, I argued with myself, I would be a dent in Tyler's fender if Edward hadn't acted so quickly to save me. I countered that it might have been sheer reflexes, but if it was a reflex to save lives, how bad could he really be? My head spun around in circles that offered no answer. There was one thing I was sure of. If I was sure of anything at all, the dark, terrifying Edward in my dream last night was simply a reflection of my fear of the word Jacob had spoken, and not a reflection of Edward himself. Even so, when I had screamed out in terror at the werewolf's lunge, it wasn't fear for the wolf that brought the cry of no to my lips. It was fear that he would be harmed, even as he had called to me with sharp-edged fangs in the dream. I had feared for him. I knew in that moment that I had my answer. I didn't know if there was ever truly a choice to be made. I was already in far too deep to pull back now. Now that I knew, if I knew for certain, I realized I could do nothing about my frightening secret. When I thought of him, of his voice, his hypnotic eyes, the magnetic force of his personality, I wanted nothing more than to be with him right now. But I couldn't think it fully. Not here, alone in the deepening dark of the forest. Not while the quiet rain made it dim as twilight under the heavy canopy and pattered like approaching footsteps across the matted earthen floor. I shivered, rising quickly from my concealed spot, instantly worried that the path would somehow have disappeared with the constant rain. But the trail was still there, safe and clear, winding its way out of the dripping green maze. I followed it hastily, pulling my hood close around my face, and as I nearly ran through the trees, I was surprised by how far I had come. I started to wonder if I was truly heading out at all, or following the path farther into the forest confines. Before I could get too panicky, I began to glimpse open spaces through the webbed branches. Then I heard a car passing on the street, and I was free. Charlie's lawn stretched out in front of me, the warm house beckoning me with the promise of dry socks. It was just noon when I got back inside. I went upstairs and quickly got dressed for the day in jeans and a t-shirt, since I was planning on staying indoors. It didn't take too much effort to concentrate on my primary task for the day, a paper on Macbeth that was due on Wednesday. I settled into outlining a rough draft contentedly, feeling more serene than I had felt since Thursday afternoon, if I was being entirely honest with myself. That had always been my way. Making decisions was the truly painful part, the part I agonized over. But once the choice was finally made, I simply followed through, usually with relief that the wrestling match with the alternatives was over. This particular decision was ridiculously easy to live with, almost dangerously easy. The rest of the day was quiet and productive. I finished my paper before 8 o'clock. Charlie came home with a large fish catch, and I made a mental note to pick up a book of recipes for fish while I was in Seattle next week. The chills that flashed up my spine whenever I thought of that upcoming trip were no different than the ones I'd felt before my walk with Jacob Black. They should be different, I thought. I knew I should be afraid of what I was embracing, but I simply couldn't feel the right kind of fear anymore. I slept dreamlessly that night, exhausted from having started my day so early and sleeping so poorly the night before. I woke up for the second time since arriving in Forks to the bright, intense yellow light of a sunny day. I skipped to the window, stunned to see that there was hardly a cloud in the sky, and those that were there were just tiny, fleecy white puffs that couldn't possibly be carrying any rain. I opened the window, surprised when it opened silently without sticking, and sucked in the relatively dry air. It was nearly warm and hardly windy at all. My blood felt electric in my veins. Charlie was finishing breakfast when I came downstairs, and he immediately picked up on my unusual mood. He commented on the nice day outside, and I agreed with a wide grin. He smiled back, his brown eyes crinkling around the edges, and when Charlie smiled, it was easy to see why he and my mother had rushed into an early marriage. I ate breakfast cheerily, watching the dust motes stirring in the sunlight that streamed in the back window. Charlie called out a final goodbye, and I heard the cruiser pull away from the house. I hesitated on my way out the door, my hand on my rain jacket. It felt like tempting fate to leave it home, but with a sigh, I folded it over my arm and stepped out into the brightest light I had seen in months. By dint of much effort, I was able to get both windows in the truck almost completely rolled down. I arrived at school early, having not even checked the clock in my hurry to get outside. I parked and headed toward the seldom-used picnic benches on the south side of the cafeteria. The benches were still a little damp, so I sat on my jacket, glad to have a use for it. My homework was already done, but there were a few trigonometry problems I wasn't sure I had right. I took out my book, but halfway through rechecking the first problem, I was daydreaming, watching the sunlight play on the red-barked trees. I sketched inattentively along the margins of my homework, and after a few minutes, I suddenly realized I'd drawn 5 pairs of dark eyes staring out of the page at me. I scrubbed them out quickly with the eraser. I heard Mike call my name, and I looked around, realizing the school grounds had become populated while I'd been sitting there, absent-minded. Everyone was in t-shirts, some even in shorts, though the temperature couldn't be over 60 degrees. Mike was coming toward me in khaki shorts and a striped rugby shirt, waving his arm. I called back to him, waving, unable to be half-hearted on a morning like this. He came to sit by me, the tidy spikes of his hair shining golden in the light, his grin stretching across his face. He was so delighted to see me that I couldn't help but feel gratified. He commented that he had never noticed before, but my hair had red in it, catching a strand that was fluttering in the light breeze between his fingers. I told him it only showed in the sun, and I became just a little uncomfortable as he tucked the lock behind my ear. He commented again that it was a great day, and I agreed, saying it was my kind of day. He asked what I had done yesterday, his tone sounding just a bit too proprietary. I told him I mostly worked on my essay, choosing not to add that I was already finished with it. He hit his forehead with the heel of his hand, realizing the homework was due soon, and I corrected him that it was due Wednesday, not Thursday, which caused him to frown. He looked completely bewildered when I told him what I was writing my paper on, and he said he would have to work on that tonight. He admitted he was going to ask if I wanted to go out, and I was taken off guard, hating how every pleasant conversation with Mike became awkward so quickly. He smiled hopefully, suggesting we could go to dinner, and he could work on his paper later. I hated being put on the spot, and told him I didn't think that would be the best idea. His face immediately fell, and he asked why, his eyes guarded, and my thoughts flickered to Edward, wondering if Mike was thinking of him too. I told him, making sure he knew I was serious, that if he ever repeated what I was saying I would cheerfully beat him to death, but I thought going out would hurt Jessica's feelings. He was bewildered, clearly not thinking in that direction at all, and asked, "Jessica?" I asked him if he was blind, and he exhaled, clearly dazed by the idea. I took advantage of his distraction to make my escape, saying it was time for class and I couldn't be late again. I gathered my books and stuffed them in my bag. We walked in silence to Building 3, his expression distracted. I hoped whatever thoughts he was immersed in were leading him in the right direction. When I saw Jessica and Trig, she was bubbling with enthusiasm. She, Angela, and Lauren were planning to go to Port Angeles tonight to go dress shopping for the dance, and she wanted me to come too, even though I didn't need a dress. I was indecisive. It would be nice to get out of town with girlfriends, but Lauren would be there, and who knew what I might be doing tonight. I quickly pulled my mind back from that dangerous path and gave her a maybe, saying I'd have to talk with Charlie first. She talked of nothing but the dance on the way to Spanish, continuing without interruption when class ended, 5 minutes late, and we were on our way to lunch. I was far too lost in my own growing anticipation to notice much of what she said. I was painfully eager to see not just him, but all the Cullens, wanting to compare them with the new, disturbing suspicions that plagued my mind. As I crossed the threshold of the cafeteria, I felt the first true tingle of fear slither down my spine and settle in my stomach. Would they be able to know what I was thinking now? And then a different feeling jolted through me. Would Edward be waiting to sit with me again? As was my routine, I glanced first toward the Cullens' table, and a shiver of panic trembled in my stomach as I realized it was entirely empty. With dwindling hope, my eyes scoured the rest of the cafeteria, hoping to find him alone, waiting for me. The place was nearly filled. Spanish had made us late, but there was no sign of Edward or any of his family. Desolation hit me with a crippling strength. I shambled along behind Jessica, no longer bothering to pretend to listen to her chatter. We were late enough that everyone was already at our table. I avoided the empty chair next to Mike in favour of one by Angela. I vaguely noticed that Mike held the chair out politely for Jessica, and that her face lit up in response. Angela asked a few quiet questions about the Macbeth paper, which I answered as naturally as I could while spiralling downward in misery. She too invited me to go with them tonight, and I agreed immediately, grasping at anything to distract myself. I realized I'd been holding on to a last shred of hope when I entered biology, saw his empty seat, and felt a new, heavy wave of disappointment. The rest of the day passed slowly, dismally. In gym we had a lecture on the rules of badminton, which was the next torture they had lined up for me. But at least it meant I got to sit and listen instead of stumbling around on the court. The best part was the coach didn't finish the lecture, so I got another day off tomorrow. I was glad to leave campus, so I would be free to pout and mope before I went out tonight with Jessica and company. But right after I walked in the door of Charlie's house, Jessica called to cancel our plans. I tried to be happy that Mike had asked her out to dinner. I was truly relieved that he finally seemed to be catching on, but my enthusiasm sounded completely false in my own ears. She rescheduled our shopping trip for tomorrow night instead. This left me with very little in the way of immediate distractions. I had fish marinating for dinner, with a salad and bread left over from the night before, so there was nothing I needed to do there. I spent a focused half hour on homework, but then I was through with that too. I checked my email, reading the backlog of letters from my mother, which got snippier as they progressed to the present. I sighed and typed a quick response, giving pathetic excuses for not writing sooner, and then told her it was sunny outside and I was going to go outside and soak up as much vitamin D as I could. I decided to kill an hour with non-school related reading. I had a small collection of books that came with me to Forks, the shabbiest volume being a compilation of the works of Jane Austen. I selected that one and headed to the backyard, grabbing a ragged old quilt from the linen cupboard on my way down. Outside in Charlie's small square yard, I folded the quilt in half and laid it out of the reach of the trees' shadows on the thick lawn, which would always be slightly wet. I lay on my stomach, crossing my ankles in the air, flipping through the novels in the book, trying to decide which would occupy my mind the most thoroughly. I started Sense and Sensibility, only to remember after I began chapter 3 that the hero of the story happened to be named Edward. Angrily, I turned to Mansfield Park, but the hero of that piece was named Edmund, which was just too close. I snapped the book shut, annoyed, and rolled over onto my back. I pushed my sleeves up as high as they would go and closed my eyes. I told myself severely that I would think of nothing but the warmth on my skin. The breeze was light, but it blew tendrils of my hair around my face, which tickled a bit. I pulled all my hair over my head, letting it fan out on the quilt above me, and focused again on the heat that touched my eyelids, my cheekbones, my neck, and soaked through my light shirt. The next thing I was conscious of was the sound of Charlie's cruiser turning onto the bricks of the driveway. I sat up in surprise, realizing the light was gone, hidden behind the trees, and I had fallen asleep. I looked around, feeling muddled and with the sudden feeling that I wasn't alone. I asked Charlie, but I could hear his door slamming in front of the house. I jumped up, foolishly edgy, gathering the now damp quilt and my book. I ran inside to get some oil heating on the stove, realizing that dinner would be late. Charlie was hanging up his gun belt and stepping out of his boots when I came in. I stifled a yawn and apologized that dinner wasn't ready yet. Saying I had fallen asleep outside, he told me not to worry about it, as he wanted to catch the score on the basketball game anyway. I watched television with Charlie after dinner, for something to do. There wasn't anything I wanted to watch, but he knew I didn't like baseball, so he turned it to some mindless sitcom that neither of us enjoyed. He seemed happy, though, to be doing something together, and it felt good despite my depression to make him happy. During a commercial, I asked him if Jessica and Angela were going to look at dresses for the dance tomorrow night in Port Angeles, and if he minded if I went with them to help them choose. He asked if I meant Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber, and I sighed as I gave him the details. He was confused, asking if I was going to the dance, and I explained that I was helping them find dresses, giving them constructive criticism. He seemed to realize that he was out of his depth with the girly stuff and said, "Well, okay," but reminded me it was a school night. I assured him we would leave right after school so we could get back early, and asked if he would be okay for dinner. He reminded me that he had fed himself for 17 years before I arrived, and I muttered that I didn't know how he survived. I then told him more clearly that I would leave some things for cold-cut sandwiches in the fridge. Right on top, it was sunny again in the morning, and I awakened with renewed hope that I grimly tried to suppress. I dressed for the warmer weather in a deep blue V-neck blouse, something I would have worn in the dead of winter in Phoenix. I planned my arrival at school so that I barely had time to make it to class. With a sinking heart, I circled the full parking lot looking for a space, while also searching for the silver Volvo that was clearly not there. I parked in the last row and hurried to English, arriving breathless but subdued, before the final bell. It was the same as yesterday. I just couldn't keep little sprouts of hope from budding in my mind, only to have them squashed painfully as I searched the lunchroom in vain and sat at my empty biology table. The Port Angeles scheme was back on again for tonight and made all the more attractive by the fact that Lauren had other obligations. I was anxious to get out of town so I could stop glancing over my shoulder, hoping to see him appearing out of the blue the way he always did. I vowed to myself that I would be in a good mood tonight and not ruin Angela's or Jessica's enjoyment in the dress hunting. I even refused to think that I might be shopping alone in Seattle this weekend, no longer interested in the earlier arrangement because surely he wouldn't cancel without at least telling me first. After school, Jessica followed me home in her old white Mercury so that I could ditch my books and truck. I brushed through my hair quickly when I was inside, feeling a slight lift of excitement as I contemplated getting out of Forks. I left a note for Charlie on the table, explaining again where to find dinner, switched my scruffy wallet from my school bag to a purse I rarely used, and ran out to join Jessica. We went to Angela's house next, and she was waiting for us. My excitement increased exponentially as we actually drove out of the town limits.